Lelia Marie Hampton is a Ph.D. student in computer science at MIT. Their research interests are artificial intelligence and ethics, AI safety, computational social science, computational sustainability, human-centered AI, user experience in marginalized groups, and non-Euclidean optimization. They are an MIT Presidential Fellow and Alfred P. Sloan Scholar, and they received an honorable mention for the Ford Foundation Fellowship. Leela earned a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, Summa Cum Laude with minors in Comparative Women's Studies and Mathematics from Spelman College, class of 2020, where they were inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. During undergrad, they interned at the MIT Media Lab, Microsoft Research, Georgia Tech Research Institute, and NASA. They've been a passionate volunteer and mentor for students from underrepresented minorities through their work in computer science teaching and mentoring programs, including Black Girls Code, Georgia Tech Catalyst, CodeHouse, and the executive board of MIT's Graduate Application Assistance Program. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Leela to talk about non-binary representation in artificial intelligence.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Arjun. And also, I just want to thank Queer in AI for having me. Just thank you for having me and allowing me to just, I guess, give my opinion on something, I suppose. But yeah, okay. Oh, I think I started my broadcast. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, awesome. So I saw William here. Shout out to William also. And all the other founders and organizers of Queer in AI. But yeah, so this talk, as Arjun said, is about non-binary representation in AI. And I actually, they gave me this title and I thought it was a very interesting title, and it kind of seemed like it could be interpreted in several ways. And I actually chose to interpret it. I suppose one way that it could have been interpreted was it could have been interpreted as representation of non-binary people in the field of AI, but I kind of wanted to frame it a little bit as something that I'm interested in, which is like from the perspective of like using non-binary epistemologies in AI research, such as AI ethics or human-centered AI, AI safety, things of that nature. And also I want to shout out to Keys, my Pookie, because they have done great work in this area. And honestly, this presentation would not have been possible without like a lot of the work they've done in the past. So yeah. And yeah, so I guess like just getting into it, and I'll get into like what I mean by like non-binary in a minute. For those who like may be unfamiliar, I understand it's Queer in AI, but there may be like some allies here or some people who are curious here who may not understand. But just even starting off with gender as a colonial construct, the way that the world understands gender today is inherently based on colonialist ideologies, and a lot of people have become excluded from these ideologies because they have become essentially binary, and they and gender roles have been made to be captured in a very specific way and socialized in a very specific way. And there's been erasure of like intersex people, there's been erasure of like two-spirit people in like indigenous communities and things of that nature. And there's just been, yeah, but anyways, some may retort to this as gender has always existed across societies, but it hasn't really existed in the same way that it was constructed during colonialism for very specific purposes. And so, for instance, Black and Indigenous womanhood in gender will always be more expansive than can be understood through a colonial lens. So, and actually like Indigenous here, I mean also Indigenous people to the Americas, but just thinking about just indigeneity at large, like people who are indigenous to an area and things of that nature. But yes, so it'll always be more expansive than can be understood through a colonial lens. Even more so, I think this argument is reinforced by just the fact that you can only understand racialized womanhood in the West as constructed and juxtaposed in a juxtaposed way to white womanhood, to reinforce and uphold racial capitalist hierarchies. In fact, some Black feminist scholars would argue that like Black women are not women through the lens of social construction of gender during the period of chattel slavery. And so that kind of continues to this day. And this is just one argument of gender as a colonial construct. There are like many, many, many more. And this could honestly just be a workshop in and of itself, but yeah. But coming to like some understanding of like what we mean by non-binary. Non-binary generally connotates some notion of living outside of the gender binary, like cis man and cis woman, and even like some Black non-binary scholars will contend that even trans men and women are outside of the binary, because the binary is a very specific power structure made based on cisnormativity. So yeah, that is in some ways only able to be captured by certain races, and again, like by, and not even certain races, really white people, and by being able to occupy certain statuses that are socially constructed, such as like, oh, assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth and things of that nature. But one way to understand, oh, by the way, being non-binary is like very expansive also. So it includes being genderless, being multigender, or being gender fluid. I contend that it is not a third gender, because the whole point of it is to kind of, again, exist outside of the gender binary, even though I understand that some people can actually be like a cis woman and also non-binary at the same time. But I think that also comes with an understanding that non-binary will actually be, again, more expansive as time goes on. So again, like thinking of like womanhood in general, like, and like again like Black womanhood, Indigenous womanhood, etc., can't really be captured simply in the idea of like cis womanhood in the West in a lot of ways. Like it's always going to be more expansive than can be captured by the ideas of like white womanhood and things of that nature. But anyways, it's not really, I would say, either a gender identity, because again, the whole point is to exist outside of like the gender binary, and be able to have some sort of nuance, some sort of fluidity. But yeah, but due to cisnormativity, like a lot of people are uncomfortable with understanding people as genderless. And like a lot of times when people look at somebody, like wherever it may be, they'll initially in their head begin to try and assign like a binary gender to that person, like they're a man or they're a woman. But even if they don't register that person as cis, they will still try to, again, assign that person to a binary gender. And if they can't immediately assign a gender, then they become uncomfortable and perhaps even violent. But yeah. And just thinking about being Black and non-binary, like in a lot of ways, I think like Black non-binary people have this discussion a lot about how just our gender is, well, it's not only lacking, but it's just not accessible to white supremacist worldviews. And the way that I lack gender cannot be understood through any lens of Western society. Like I've even come to the understanding that like I am affirmed by they, them pronouns, but they, them pronouns will never ever capture the way that I transcend gender. And in the same way, there's really no lexicon that can reconcile the way that Black, trans, and non-binary people reconcile gender. But yeah. But coming kind of sort of to like the question of like gender and AI research, who has the power to define gender and AI research? Because even who gets to decide what constitutes gender in AI and AI related research is an issue of power. And often the conceptualization of gender ends up invisibilizing people who don't fall neatly into the cisnormative binary. And even just adding more gender categories isn't enough to capture the nuances of gender. And it's not enough to say like, oh, we'll just create more categories. And like, what does it even mean to even classify people based on colonial gender constructs? And for instance, you can't necessarily take an AI system where you classified people based on gender and then port that over to other places around the world, because their understanding of gender is not going to necessarily match what we mean over here. And that's, you know, so transness in many ways resists neat, stable categorizations, and gender globally also kind of resists these neat, stable categorizations from the Indigenous perspective. But yeah. And so coming to the point of like kind of, I guess, positionality of AI researchers, I think that like being cis deeply impacts the way that cis researchers engage with gender in their research. And I think also a lot of cis people don't engage with non-binary people and non-binary epistemologies on a daily basis, since cis normativity is socialized from birth. So I think that they actually don't really 100% understand or even necessarily care to understand on some levels. And I think it makes sense that their work tends to be trans exclusionary in that respect. And I don't think it's enough to do this thing where researchers will add a one-line sentence about trans people. That's not being, you know, trans expansive, or that's not trans allyship either. And it could actually just be very violent to be like, oh, we'll just do one sentence and keep it pushing. Because what you're saying is trans people aren't important enough to talk about, and they're only important enough such that in order to make yourself like your PR better, to make you look better, like, oh, I care about social justice, oh, I'm trans exclusive, oh, I'm on like the left, I'm a liberal, etc. But when really you're doing again is being trans exclusionary, because one sentence is simply not enough to capture the nuances needed to discuss the relationship between trans people and AI. But yeah, again, the cis girlies are just generally trans exclusionary. And I mean, there's been previous work on the relationship between gender and AI. And sometimes it's been analyzed with other things such as race and like called intersectional. But I think there's an inherent cis normativity to the research for like two immediate reasons, which is the process of understanding comes from like a very trans exclusionary perspective in which everyone is a cis man or a cis woman. And so then there's not even an attempt to understand what it means to like not be either of those things. I think also you could just easily be misgendering somebody, and you're kind of banking on cis normativity, like, and assuming that people will fall into a cisgender binary categorization when that's just not true. You don't know, like when you're labeling pictures or like voice, whatever, when you're labeling messages, when you're labeling tweets, what gender that person is, or if they even have a gender. So it's just it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, anyway, let's see. Okay. But I don't think you could talk about like non-binary epistemologies in AI without talking about data, because data is literally like the life force of AI. So you do have to have some like understanding of like the data ethics aspect, the privacy aspect, and you know, the critical data studies aspect. But yeah, because I mean, even thinking about how in a lot of ways, yeah, and then gender is just like conflated with sex in a lot of data sets, and people are labeled as female or male. They erase intersex people, and it's just, I think it's in some ways an attempt to reconcile stuff like, oh, what were you born as, even though it just doesn't do what they think it does, if that makes any sense. It actually tends to be extremely just trans exclusionary rather than helpful. And it's just like very upsetting when your only options are like female or male. There's not even other. And I mean, like, other is like still problematic though, because again, the whole point of cis normativity is seeing cis people as the default. So then they get to be seen as the default, and you have to specify because you're other, like, which is funny because I think in like social theory, we call it being othered, and like they literally othered us. So it's kind of like funny in a sense, but it's also kind of messed up. So it'll be like cis man, cis woman, or no, they don't even put cis in front of it. They'll just be like man, woman, transgender man, transgender woman, other, which I find to be very fascinating that there's not cis put in front of the man and the woman. It's just assumed that it's implicit, like they're cis, like we know they're the default, right? It's messed up, but yeah. And so I guess, okay, by the way, to clarify on that slide, I was actually talking about like, for instance, have you ever been in like a Google form and you have to specify, or you've been in another form and you're specifying for whatever it is, like the government, your school, whatever it may be, like however they get that data, or yeah, again, however they choose to get that data. And sometimes you voluntarily have to get that data. And then, yeah, then there's the other please specify, and it just ends up being very messed up, but yeah. And yeah, so I guess kind of coming to understand like the way that non-binary like beings have just been like completely invisibilized and erased and excluded, and even trans people in at large have been excluded from like AI, and in this particular case computer vision. But yeah, so the assumption is that with automatic gender recognition is that somebody can actually make a distinction of gender based on just physiology alone, which is like weird. But and this comes, and then this also gets dangerous because when you have like crowd workers or somebody else, like some form of data labelers who are labeling pictures or something else, then what happens is they end up being cisnormative and assuming what people like are. And then also one inherent assumption is that these categories are immutable, so that person will never change. Like they will never end up deciding like, oh, I'm actually going to go be some sort of like trans being, whether it's woman, man, or like non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, agender, etc. Like there's just, there's just not that understanding. It's just, it ends up being immutable or whatever. And so yeah, it just ends up being like trans exclusionary and cisnormative. And like a lot of people end up getting misgendered in that process, which is inherently violent. And it just doesn't really make much sense as a practice in terms of just in everyday use. I think it probably makes a lot of sense for like governments because they're probably using it for surveillance and they don't really care as much if they're misgendering you. They actually have like other means that like they use, and they like, I think one of their goals is probably to like reinforce some sort of like cisnormative binary. But anyway, and also thinking about like the NLP side and like linguistic data, one thing that has been proposed by companies is, oh, we'll make gender neutral voices and it'll be representative, and so that trans people can feel more included. But then like they did a study and they actually found that like trans users like think about this in a much more complex way than simply thinking like, oh, we need to be represented, we need to be included in like the voice or whatever, in the way that the voice sounds when we're talking to the AI and it's talking back to us or whatever. But yeah, what they found is that people actually care, like one of the considerations that they really care about is like surveillance in terms of structural power, and like are companies actually like pretending to be queer trans friendly to monetize their product, and kind of like what they call pink washing or rainbow capitalism or whatever. Like, are they pretending to do that to monetize their product? And in that way, it just becomes like extremely violent. And they're just commodifying transness. And it's not actually inclusive. It's just inclusive for a product, which is very scary in a lot of ways. But yeah. And thinking about like what even comes with inclusion on that note, like inclusion is not inherently positive for trans and non-binary communities. You can't just say like, oh, we'll include them in the AI, we'll include them in the research, or we'll include them in that, because there could be potential drawbacks that need to be considered. And that's why I mentioned like privacy studies, surveillance studies, data ethics, etc. And even like a lot of people, I think, need to probably, from some of the stuff I read, probably need to read more of like trans and queer theory, because especially in the modern day, because like you can end up being very cisnormative in your research and only centering cis people, and that can just end up being very violent. And you can also just miscomprehend non-binary people, like again, because you can't just say like non-binary is a gender identity when there are many non-binary people who are like, no, we're genderless, right? So it just doesn't make sense to even like think. So like there's a vocabulary, a nuance, and other things that are needed, a certain respect, and all these other things that, like, to be honest, some cisgender people may not be able to perform if they want to be quote unquote inclusive. So that's why I say like it's not inherently positive. And so also like there could be illicit and non-consensual data collection. So they can collect data without your knowledge or without your permission, and then you wouldn't even know. And you didn't even want to give them permission for that. And now you could be subject to arbitrary hypersurveillance that you did not sign up for, right? And so that also includes just like, well, not, I mean, in a way, it also includes like dead data from pre-transition. So if you have like certain pronouns, again, like the whole female male thing, blah, 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 your name is not correct in the database, then that can like, and then like things are different across databases and all these other things that can also pose some like issues like for AI systems and stuff like that, and it's unclear how to like reconcile that, and it's unclear if there's a nice non-violent way to even do that. But yeah, and also I think one thing that could be very scary also is being told as a community what you need rather than asked. Because I mean, that's what some researchers with power tend to do, is assume maybe what a community needs. And then they're like, oh, we're gonna go do it, instead of just asking that community what they need. And in a way that can just lead to like violent research and violent systems and other violent things. And so you inherently have to make sure that your research is like responsible, consensual, and participatory. And also like you have to be honest about who your research speaks for, like because there are other things to consider, such as like race, country, language, like imperialist considerations, all these other things that you kind of have to consider before you can just go in and say, oh, we're about to go do research and stuff like that on like non-binary people, or try to include non-binary people in our research. And also if you have a non-binary person on your research team, it actually has to be a consensual process. Although also you can't just bully your non-binary graduate student into being on a research project that they don't want to be on, or bully your non-binary employee into being on like a machine learning project that they don't want to be on. Like you have to be like, everything has to be a consensual process, essentially. And you also should just not be doing research that like a lot of non-binary people are like, no, that's violent, like you shouldn't do that. Yeah. And I think that's it. So thank y'all so much for listening to me ramble. And yeah, and I guess I don't know, questions or something to that effect.
Yeah, if anyone has questions for Leela, just drop them. Oh, we already have the first question. Oh, Dory Hart. Yes, Dory Hart. If anyone has any questions about the presentation or otherwise, like anything.
Oh. Yeah.
Dory indeed is very cute. You can put it in the chat. You can put it in the Q&A feature, completely up to you. Okay, I'll give it a few seconds. Oh, we have a comment, some praise.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we have our first question from William, and I'll just read it out loud. Do you think even with a good application of, say, participatory design methods, it is possible for queer people to be represented in large machine learning models? Do you think this is desirable, or are there particular applications that you think are especially good or bad?
Yeah, yeah, I think that this is in like, yeah, y'all already know I'm problematic and I'm gonna have to say it, but like, I think that, you know, large, especially like when you bring in issues of like capitalism, there's just, I think that a lot of companies are profit driven and they don't really care who they hurt in the process, in terms of like getting to the end goal of that model. So again, like the participatory design can actually like be extremely violent if it's not consensual, because you can like peer pressure people, you can ask questions that like leading questions where like they don't have a say in like, oh, maybe this is not the best question to ask. Like, we think that maybe this is probably something else that we're thinking about, right? Because again, like with the voice activated AI system, a company just was like, oh yeah, like this is what y'all need. But then like trans people were like, but what about like surveillance? Like, how do I know like that you're like voice activated AI isn't surveilling me? How do I know that like you're not just doing this to appeal to like queer and trans people and stuff like that? And I think that there's always going to be like a bad application. And I think that like that's what makes it hard sometimes to even talk about like distinctions between like this or that, because like I think some things are going to be like inherently carceral, inherently harmful, inherently violent. And then people are gonna like, I don't, so it just gets really bad very quick. And then yeah, and I think there like needs to be some conversations and I'm probably like a little biased right now because I'm like working on like some work right now and like the relationship between like capitalism and like technology. But I just think that there's like a lot of interest on the part of companies where they, again, like put profit over like literal human lives sometimes. And I do mean like literal human lives. And yeah.
Any other questions? We'll take maybe 1 to 2 more questions. Give it a few seconds, otherwise I'll ask a question. Okay, I'll ask a quick question. So I think this is actually like a conversation that was happening on the Bird site a few days ago about like whether, like you brought up the excellent point of like how, I mean, machine learning as a field is very based on this idea of classification and categorization. And if we try to be more inclusive of a variety of non-binary gender identities, how can we exactly do that without like continuing to bin them or categorize them into like smaller groups that continue to exclude people? Or like, should we even be modeling gender of any kind?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think that like, yeah, I think it is like what are we even gain by modeling gender, quote unquote? Like what are we supposed to be gaining from that? And it's like not 100% clear again what we're supposed to be gaining from that. And I think there's like systems like that in general where it's like I don't see what the point of this is. Like there's very few uses for this besides like doing something very harmful or like doing something with surveillance or doing something for like the carceral state. And so I think that's like generally one of those things where it's like, yeah, like what do you gain by putting gender in your system? And I don't know, I mean it's an expansive question. So I think also it's like for quote unquote healthcare that actually could maybe be positive because gender lack there, like I mean again, like being cis, being trans, being a cis woman, being a trans woman, being a trans man, being non-binary, being bisexual, being lesbian, etc., can actually be like an indicator that you can have like issues with mental health or you can have issues with like medicine or other things of that nature. So it might be like, for instance, I'm not going to say like, oh, maybe every system shouldn't have it, because like I've done some readings where it's like, well, you know, sometimes you should consider that because like those could be risk factors. But I think there's also an issue of like correlation and causation. And I think even getting down into it, like the medicalization of it, and like I mean even then it's like, well, the issue and why like there's different health outcomes is like inherently based on oppression and not necessarily like simply occupying an identity. But yeah, so it gets inherently complex, I think. But yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. You can probably take 1 more question. If there are no other questions though, we might move on. I'll give it like 5 to 10 more seconds. I have the Jeopardy like theme song stuck in my head.
Yay. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, maybe, yeah, I guess like Willie has tons of questions, and since you're like a Willie stan, you can definitely take this offline and about it.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.